Good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome you to the School of Social Work 2018 Leon and Josephine Winkelman Memorial Lecture. I'm Dean Lynn Videcka, Dean of the School of Social Work, and I want to thank you for joining us for what I'm sure is going to be an engaging and informative presentation and conversation. The Leon and Josephine Winkelman Memorial Lecture was established in 1978 at the University of Michigan School of Social Work with an endowed gift from Stanley J. Winkelman and his brothers as a memorial and tribute to their parents. Stanley's father, Leon Winkelman, co-founded Winkelman Stores in 1928 with his brother Isidore. Stanley's mother was a 1919 graduate from the University of Michigan social work program, and she worked at Hull House, a well-known, a legendary settlement house in Chicago, my hometown. The Winkelman Lecture provides a forum for presenting new and emerging knowledge from the social sciences and the helping professions in the field of gerontology, and also for discussing the application of this knowledge to developing social policy, the organization and management of social welfare services, and the delivery of social work services. Stanley J. Winkelman was a leader in civic affairs in Detroit. After the 1967 uprising sent other retailers to the suburbs, Stanley kept his family's department stores in the city, hoping that their presence could contribute to and sustain an environment suitable for doing business. Mr. Winkelman was deeply involved in social justice issues throughout the city. In 1963, as part of the Detroit Commission on Community Relations, he called upon the Detroit Bureau of Education to hire more Black teachers to further desegregate Detroit's teaching force. In 1967, he led a new Detroit subcommittee on community services, and he called for an investigation of the Detroit Police Department. Stanley passed away in 1999, but his legacy lives on in the Detroit community and at the University of Michigan. We're very, very thankful to the Winkelman family for their support of this important annual event that informs our profession and provides us with the opportunity to honor our alumni Josephine Winkelman and her husband Leon. I want to, before I introduce today's speaker, the esteemed Dr. Keith Whitfield, I want to give a special thanks to our gerontology learning community who organized today's event, and I want to give a special shout out to our development office, including Emma, Susan Himley-Wills, and the rest of the team, Claire Higgins, who really works to make this event possible and such a great event, a real signature event of the year. This afternoon, we're fortunate to have one of the leaders in the field of gerontology with us today. Dr. Keith Whitfield is Provost and Professor of Psychology from Wayne State University, and he will deliver our keynote presentation, The Use of Family Designs to Understand Aging in African Americans. Following Dr. Whitfield's presentation, we brought together a panel of experts from various fields to provide their unique perspectives. School of Social Work Professor Robert Taylor will serve as a moderator for the panel discussion and conversation. And it's now my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Keith Whitfield. As provost at Wayne State University, Dr. Whitfield is responsible for faculty hiring, promotion and tenure, and budget policies relevant to more than 2,600 faculty and staff. In this role, he's also responsible for student affairs, including student success, curriculum, the dean of students, and housing. And I can say, after the privilege of having had lunch with Dr. Whitfield, he brings a rousing enthusiasm and great creativity to that all-important role of provost. Dr. Whitfield has received research funding through the National Institute of Aging, National Institutes of Health, and the National Science Foundation for projects totaling over $20 million. And he's co-authored over 200 publications. His research spans a range of topics that focus on individual differences in minority aging. Dr. Whitfield has worked with researchers from Sweden, Russia, and the United States to examine how social, psychological, and cultural factors of aging are affected by genetic and environmental influences that impact cognition and health during adulthood and late life. Dr. Whitfield has conducted one of the only in-person studies of adult African American twins, which involved examining psychosocial factors related to their health. His current project is a study to understand the relationship between stress and longevity in African American families. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Keith Whitfield.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes.
This is you guys got too much technology. I'm used to just, getting up and standing and yelling at people. You know something? I can tell you, it's going to be too hot here for me. So funny having lived down in the South for so long. You kind of wonder how I even survive. Because I sweat, I'll build up a sweat. I do get a little excited. I'm going to try to calm down. I'm going to try to stay in our time constraint, but we'll see. Usually it's so funny when you're a guest, people don't want to insult you by giving you the hook and pulling you off. So it makes life a lot easier. So I'm going to talk about a bunch of things. This is about aging, but as you'll see, I'm going to try to use just a couple of examples, really talk more about designs and what you might be able to get from those designs. And so the aging could be anything. It could be psychosocial factors, it could be health, it could be cognition, it could be development, it could be social relationships. I think you can use it for lots of things. But I'm going to talk just a little bit about the design, some things I've done and used in the past. And hopefully maybe even during the discussion section, we can think about ways in which, I haven't done everything, ways in which you might ask, can you do things with that? But before you start, there's always a start to these things. There's always a start to careers. There's always a start towards research. And I think far more often than we give it credit for, they come from practical, simple things. They come from our lives. And so, very interesting. My study and appreciation for the influence of families comes from my dad. Okay, this is my dad. My dad passed away 4 years ago now. And it's so interesting about life because he used to tell me about living in Chicago. He's a Chicagoan. And he went to the military, got shipped eventually overseas. And interestingly enough, I was born overseas. So I'm in one of those moods. So we're going to have audience participation. So where was I born? Give me 3 possible countries. Germany. Good guess. There's a lot of military over there. Korea. Kim Jong-un was my best buddy. Italy. All wrong. So look from this side. I was born in Japan. Okay. So I was born in Japan, and interestingly enough, while he was over there, and basically when I was born, he got asked if he wanted to go to Officers Candidate School because he had some years of education. So he went back to school. He went to the University of Colorado. And so he went to the University of Colorado, got his degree, and guess what his first duty station was? Selfridge. And so this is this interesting coming back, I think, to Michigan for me. And it really does make me think about a lot of the things that, actually, as I grow a little bit older, the widow's peak is trying to come through. And I used to think about how different my dad was. He was a data systems manager. Yeah, I use Windows. Just very, very different in many ways. But for each of you that probably realizes as you grow older, you start to see your parents in you. You start to see some of the things that you learn from them. It's just fascinating. And I sometimes think that part of the reason why I actually have done family studies is because of what I think about relative to my family, and particularly the patriarch, my father. So wanted to go over this really, really quickly, particularly how many students in the audience, raise your hand, be all proud. Okay. So how in the world do you get started? How in the world, when you talk to these world-class researchers, where did they get started? And you have to basically browbeat them to get them to tell you, how did you get started? And for some of them, they do so much, you don't get, it looks like they do everything. So I don't do everything, but I put it in a picture, okay? So I was interested in individual differences in aging. I wanted to try to figure out why people were different from one another. It really started off even from perceptions about how my dad saw the world and how I saw the world, about how people saw the world. I said, even within families, it's so different from one another. There's got to be something that's the same and something that's different even when you're in the same family. So through lots of different influences, far too many to go into for now, I said, well, let me do both studies of individuals and how they're different, but even that family piece, because I think the family piece is important. And because particularly when I started off, I was just a lowly assistant professor with no resources and didn't know anybody. Actually, many of the people that I started knowing and that inspired me are here. People like Robert Taylor and Linda Chatters. They were still new at the time, but they were leading the field, doing these exciting things and taking no prisoners. And then I met James Jackson, which truly, truly changed my life. But I said, so let's, no holds barred. Let's do primary data that I go and pick up, and let me go and try to get by with a little help from my friends and use secondary data. And so I would use both with these different types of designs to be able to try to understand why people varied, why, particularly as they grow older, why might they be different? Are people in their later lives, like Laura Carstensen will tell us about how socio-emotional selective theory makes you so that you get particular when you get older. You don't want to just spend your energy on everybody. You want to spend it on specific things. And younger, even thinking of, I can't even think of her name, but thinking about the kinds of resources that we have and the decisions that we make as we grow older may change. So I hope that, that's the point. You found this one the most interesting one. Doesn't it look like it's almost miscategorized? It's under primary data, but it's the adult Russian twin study. Yes, back in 1994, just after the fall of the wall, I went to Russia. Because if you really wanted to look at how environment might play a role, here's the fall of communism, the fall of something that's supposed to affect all of your lives. I, of course, will be off track and talk way too long, but I'm going to tell you this one of many stories. So it was fascinating. So here is this African American to go study Russian twins. And I don't think, I thought it as such a great opportunity. I didn't get it until I sat in the airport. And I said, holy crap, I'm going to Russia. And so I got on the plane, I'm getting settled, and I stand up and I look, and I mean, all white people. And I thought, wow, that's interesting. Okay, yeah, I got to remember, going to a very different culture. There is different ethnicities there, but it's different. And I turned and looked, and sure enough, there was a black guy getting on the plane, and he had an 8-ball jacket on. Even at that time, I don't know if that was the end thing, but he was wearing an 8-ball jacket. And I looked over at him, and I thought, so I'm going to go into this culture, but wow, at least this is what I remember, identify with. And so I was looking at him, and he looked at me, and I looked at him, and I went, and that was all I needed. And so I was ready to go to Russia. We did this great study in Russia. So lots of different things. I'm going to focus on 2 studies today, the Carolina African American Twin Study of Aging, and then our very recent one, we call it SOLSA, or SOLSA, the study of longevity, and use those as examples to think about different ways that you might study aging in African Americans. Now, so the goals of family design, very, very basically, is to understand, for example, why kids from the same family are different. We had a Times article on that years and years ago, and people wanted to know, why is that? Robert Plomin used to ask that same question. To examine systematic effects and the contributions that actually family does. There was another Times article, I'm not giving exact citations, that were saying parents don't matter. That is the stupidest thing that anyone could ever think. It's like, well, just leave them out in the backyard and they'll raise themselves. They're not grass. These are children, okay? And actually, even how they grow up and change in their relationship with the parents changes as they grow older. Then to understand inherited aspects of behavior biology. I'm going to do a very, very quick, trying to convince those of you who think, genes don't have anything to do with my behavior kind of stalwart thinking and see if I can influence you a little bit to just say there that there is a way to think mechanistically about how that influence actually occurs. And then to understand just the origins of individual variability. So, family environmental effects. What might it mean if you actually have a family? What could it mean in lots of different ways? So, it's supposed to be arising from basically proximity, of living in the same household. And if you think about it, and I'll tell the story now because I won't tell it later, is the idea for our twins, for example, that they would, like many kids, be raised in the same household until they were about 18, some younger. These are older twins in the 50s and 60s coming to of age. And then they would go off. And it's like they would go off and they would age, and then guess what? As they grew older, they came back together. We found lots who were actually living in the same household as they were in their 70s and 80s. But at least at first, we think a lot of that powerful thing is as we're developing as individuals, we're at least in proximity to each other. We also may have the influence of our parents, of whether they're harsh or whether they're ambivalent or whether they're loving, whatever that may be, that parental style has that impact. Effects of relationships among siblings, parents' health, mental health, and economics. We could also examine family environment by looking at features within siblings. It just kind of, it's almost reverse engineering it. It's saying the reason why you're similar is because of these things rather than these things that we're studying are making you guys the same. It's a little bit backwards, subtlety, but important. Also examining intergenerational patterns to say that you're not necessarily your parents, but isn't it fascinating when you see your grandparents? And grandparents are fun. I don't admit it very often, but I'm a grandparent. Grandparents fun. Parenting, wow, that's something. But grandparenting is fun because you can just get them to do whatever you want, and it pisses off their parent, and then you walk away. You just walk away. You can move on, and they do the next thing. So looking at those intergenerational trends about the things that are passed down and things that aren't. Among African Americans, I think it's always so fascinating. If you can go back enough generations and ask them where they're from. When we think about the northern migration that happened, 30s, 40s, whatever, that there were really two big waves. One wave from the very southeastern part of the country, they tended to go up the eastern seaboard. From the ones that were in Alabama and Louisiana, they tended to come here. And also those folks actually went to the west too. And so you can go to LA and actually see a lot of Creole sorts of influences because it's the intergenerational piece for 3 or 4 generations back that came there and then passed it down. And it's the things then that we hold on to and don't hold on to about what our families do. Always interesting questions to ask. And yeah, it can be considered as direct or indirect. Was it that your brother made you hit yourself, or were you really trying to hit yourself? You have to ask yourself that question. But being around them was interesting. And it's what's so fascinating is that if you can be honest, you can see the things that you really are like your brothers and sisters about, and things that you're just completely different. And both are interesting questions. It's like, I don't think I even liked them. Why would I want to do the things that they do? Or I loved them. Why am I so different from them? Or the differences make us complement. There's lots of ways that we think about that, but how did that come about to be? That's what we try to do when we use family designs to try to study. And so there are some basic ones. I'm sure there's other ones. I'm going to throw you out just a few. One in terms of parent offspring, where you're studying parents and their children, and going either 1 generation, 2 generations, 3 generations, or more generations, looking at it how it falls through generations. Also looking at sibling designs, such as adoption designs or twin designs. I think in each one of those cases, we actually do think about the similarities and differences in kids. We just study them and they become the focus differentially. So everything is always good when you draw diagrams of things. So if we were to think about intergenerational, it's the idea that I think the conventional idea is what we think of in kind of standard America, and that's standard the way America used to be. Now America is very, very different, and that unconventional or the Passover transfer happens lots. The amount, I forgot what the statistics are on custodial grandparents, but we see lots and lots more custodial grandparents. We also see grandparents that actually have means will actually move closer to their children. Whereas before, it used to be that you returned home or you went closer to home. Now, lots of parents, grandparents who have the means will move closer because they can and they want to live near their grandchildren. I'm not going to do that, but I like to do it afar. You fly in and then you fly out. You have your effect and then you run. So now let's talk about sibling approaches. As we think about these designs, these kinds of designs where we look at the parents and that little arrow on the top, I just felt like I needed to actually put that in there and just say a little bit about it. It's the idea of kind of social homogamy. The idea that when you pick a partner, you pick them for specific reasons. And I wouldn't say how big that arrow is supposed to be because, differences attract, or there's lots of ways in which those things may happen, but there's oftentimes a connection. And even if it does not happen upon introduction to your partner, it may happen over time. That's a whole nother type of family study that one could do. And so they are providing influences for the siblings, offspring, and that, again, the size of that correlation, that little round arrow across the bottom, is what we study when we're looking at these types of designs. Now, if we take it one step further, and in a very, we can add some interesting things. We can look and say, well, let's try to look at families where there's an adopted child. Okay, so that child does not share the same biology, the same genetics as the biological child, but they're in the same family context as that child. So we can start looking at, is it because you lived in the same environment, or maybe it's because it's the biology of the parent to the child. And actually, there's even a piece that's not there, which is it's when children in the same family are actually different from one another. Some of it is from a lot of what we're caring about now about their friends. Okay, hard to be an eagle when you soar with turkeys. Okay, I raised you as an eagle, you hung out with that guy, and you became a turkey. Okay, that is those non-shared different environmental pieces, and I'll talk about it a little bit more when I talk specifically about quantitative genetic approaches. So let's see. Seeing all my good stuff here. Let's see. So
Here's that gap.
the volume went down. Yeah.
Let's see here.
That doesn't start. Okay. Well, take a look and see. There's some fascinating things that are going on in these pictures. I hope you've been watching. We've already gone through two. The last set are the ones where I think you'll make a observation. I think it's only taken a couple minutes, so I'll just film. There was music in the background, and that was going to be wonderful. These two gentlemen were fascinating. These were the two oldest twin pairs of males that we studied. At the time, they were 80 years old. And if you know about the longevity of African American, particularly men, even now where it's supposed to be advanced, it's really like 65, 67. These guys were 80, and this was 10 years ago. Now, these were our very oldest twins. They were 89 years of age at the time. You notice anything? If you didn't get it, what they did was they were both touching their ears at the same time, but a mirror reverse. Isn't that interesting? Okay. So twins are fascinating. I am not a twin. Anybody here a twin? Okay. Yeah, she's like, I'm going to take his advice and have fun with them. There's two of them, twice the fun. Twins are fascinating. I had a set of twins who were cousins, and one was Keith and one was Kevin. I'm Keith, I, of course, always sided with Kevin. But just thinking about the similarities and differences between them, it was always, I think I started this when I was like 10 or 11. So I ask you, because we usually think about twins as identical, but of course we know that they're fraternal twins, and those twins are actually genetically just as like siblings are. So take a look at that picture. Which one is the set of identical twins? And there's only one set of them. One of them are identical and one of them are fraternal. How many people say the one on your left? How many people say the one on the right? How many people did what we shouldn't have done in the last election, didn't vote? Okay. So it is the ones on the left who are the identical twins. It almost feels like it's a giveaway because they're wearing almost like the same shirt, but absolutely fascinating. So using twins, you use typically a methodology considered quantitative genetics. It's the idea that genes and environment actually contribute to individual variability, and that we can even take the environment further because the twins share the same environment and are the same age, and that part of that similarity that's not accounted for in genetics is the similarity that's from being raised in the same family at the same time. So we can use different kinds of designs, adoption designs, parent designs, and even twins. Twins is probably the most powerful one. And it's getting to the idea that the variability that you see, the reason why some children are like their siblings or not like their siblings is because of individual variability. And a lot of times we're talking about this not in terms of height or eye color or hair, we're talking about it in behavior. And so some people, they struggle with that. It's like, it's a gene. What is a gene doing relative to my behavior? It's extremely complex. It starts off with the idea that, yes, genes are there and they do influence brain chemistry. Okay? And even the environment influences brain chemistry, and even gene environment interactions, which we're actually doing much better now than we used to, actually influence those things. So those things go and change brain chemistry, and brain chemistry leading to our behavior. A little bit more, I don't know, it's just another picture. It's kind of cool. Is the idea that really we're starting from DNA, it turns into RNA, it creates proteins. Those proteins actually end up creating the kinds of neurotransmitters that we have that create the behavioral phenotypes that we study. But remember, those phenotypes are embedded in an environment, and they are in part influenced and driven by the environment too. Actually, I'm missing an arrow there. There should be an arrow hitting to the phenotype. So there's lots of things in this very, very difficult kind of cascade of different types of events that can actually occur. And so trying to pull that out, we use twin designs to be able to do that. So I'm going to share with you, you've seen a couple of them there. Here's another pair of our very, very old men who are there. The Carolina African American Twin State of Aging. And I forgot who, I think I was talking to Robert earlier on. We were talking about successes and failures and grants. And another thing to share with our students. I have actually a postdoctoral fellow who is working with me, and I've never told her this horrible, horrible story before, but I'll do it in public. So for every one of my grants, it's taken me at least 3 years. Every single one of them. It's taken at least 3 years. Really, it's taken more than 3 years because it took 3 years to get it funded. And in part because I'm a little hard-headed, and many people are saying, well, if you're going to study African Americans, you need to have a control group. Oh my gosh, we can have a whole nother, give me another lecture, I'll come up and talk about that, because that's a different one that I want to talk about. But even for twins, it was even more charged, because a lot of people think about twins, and they think about genetics, and they think about eugenics. And the problem that happened up until, for me anyway, up until I got this project funded, was the idea that somehow you shouldn't study genes in African Americans. Why? If you start from the perspective of that they are inferior in some sort of way, I guess you could have a problem with it, but guess what? Genes are still influencing behavior, and they're influencing health. And actually, the more that we don't approach science because we're afraid of it or because it's politically loaded, we actually retard the science. And so there comes the Carolina African American Twin State of Aging. You always talk about, the one who brought you to the dance, and so that's the National Institute on Aging. Just in case, you never know where those guys are. Program officers are everywhere. So, Carolina African American Twin State of Aging has 285 pairs of twins. I did what is typically not done. In twin studies, you usually include both members of the twin pair so that you can compare them. But as I was studying African Americans, actually my very first call, I call and I say, this is so-and-so, and I'm all excited because I found somebody like a needle in a haystack. And I said, are you a twin? And he says, yes, I am. I'm like, I said, so, I've been actually having problems finding your brother. Can you give me his information? And he said, oh, my brother died 2 weeks ago. And I'm like, oh, I don't want to do this work. But it made me think that, I'm going to run into this. I actually need to think that that's an opportunity rather than a limitation. And so what we did was actually collect data on both singletons and some siblings for twins who their sibling had died or their twin had died. It was done in North Carolina, home interviews. We looked at health, particularly cardiovascular risk factors, memory, physical functioning, mental health, kind of personality, and social factors. And in our final sample, the breakdown was this way. Identical twins with 202, that's individuals, it was 101 pairs, 364, 62 siblings, 78 singletons for a total interviews of 706. Now what's interesting is that a lot of people, if you see twin studies, you will see that there are more identical twins than fraternal twins. That's wrong. There shouldn't be. There should be more fraternal twins than identical twins. It's usually, I think it's a 3-to-1 difference in terms of the natural population rate. All of that has now been screwed up because people take fertility drugs. And they're having not only twins, but they're having even bigger multiple births. But naturally, that's what's supposed to happen. What's fascinating about African Americans is that African Americans in the United States anyway have twins at a rate of 2 times that of whites. Never hear about. See, fascinating things you're learning today. What a day, what a day. Also very interesting, actually the very highest rate of twins is actually found, I can't remember the country, but it's in Africa, and it's rather than it being 1% like it is in whites or 2% like it is in blacks, it's actually 14%. No one's figured that one out. Anyway, so we got busy. We started looking around and saying, hey, where are we going to find them? You find them basically everywhere. The reason why I like to show this map is to say that, some people believe in North Carolina down in the country. There are population centers there in Charlotte, in Greensboro, in Durham, in Winston-Salem. And we ended up getting people from both those population centers as well as places like, let's see, right there, Dunn, North Carolina. Oh my gosh, they tell me where their house is. This is one of the pilot ones that I use. They tell me where their house is. I drive up and it turns from a concrete road to a dirt road. And I see a little store. I'm like, I'm lost. I'm not going to do the usual guy. I'm actually going to ask for directions. I go in, 5 and dime. I mean, classic Southern kind of place. I say, I'm looking for, so-and-so and so-and-so road. Can you tell me where that's at? And I said, oh, well, you're looking for the so-and-sos. You haven't, it's not HIPAA right. You haven't signed an IRB. I'm like, well, I'm looking for this address. And look, you just go back up that road. You go over until you get over to the top of it and you just keep, I'm like, oh, okay. I go out and it is absolute middle of nowhere. So yes, we in the study actually have both rural and people living in urban settings. Very, very rural. I like to show this because I share my data with people occasionally, and they kind of are surprised. They said, well, I thought you were looking at X, Y, and Z. Why do you have 800 variables? And another lesson for our students to learn. Once you get the money, do everything you can. Collect everything, because you don't know if you're going to be back again. And so we did have an interview that was designed for 2.5 hours. The record was 7. And that's partly because the person doing it actually had got both a fish fry and a marriage proposal. She's a very cute young woman. It happened all the time. We weren't surprised. So another thing, that we study sometimes in intergenerational is the idea that something happens and then we come back to it. Something happens and then it skips a generation. So I find it fascinating. The first place I lived in the United States officially was Chicago, but the first place I lived for any length of time was actually Boulder, Colorado, where my dad was doing his degree. So always, I love Colorado. If you come to my office, come down to Wayne State. Always come in and see me. I make about 5 minutes time for anybody, but that's all you get. And you'll see I have a picture of the mountains. Love Colorado. So have lived there, was one of the first places, went back to Colorado Springs. And then as I started getting interested in trying to understand individual differences and how you do the kind of methodology for them, sure enough, the University of Colorado Boulder is one of the meccas for it. So I went back to the University of Colorado Boulder and learned how to do structural equation modeling. Now, for those of you who have not done it, it's not as intimidating as you think, because it's like doing anything else, particularly when you study families. You're looking for systematic and constellations of variability. That's all your real goal is. And it's just really a different way of trying to do that. And here, and I know there are a couple of people in here that actually have some background in quantitative genetics, but here's the truth. It is a forced model. It's a little bit of an artificial model, because what we're saying is that it's only one of 3 things. It's either genetic, SE is shared environmental, or non-shared environmental. Shared environmental, remember, as we're talking about, is the kind of things that you have as you're growing up in the same family. Non-shared environmental is that even though you grow up in the same family, boy, there are other influences that you have. Well, the other thing about that model that sometimes we don't talk about is that measurement error is a non-shared environment. And in many studies of aging, as the populations get older, what you get is a bigger NSE, a bigger non-shared environment. I couldn't tell you whether I thought that it was measurement error or whether it was just the older we grow, the more influences we have, and the different we can become even from our family. Um, it's interesting questions that you can try to answer. I just wanted to throw up just a couple that I have used this data for to try to answer. This one up in the corner up here is looking at, should be depression, right?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, depression. The red is the red is genetic influences, and blue is environmental influences. As you see, the yellow, which should be there, which is when we look at this as a measure of cognitive impairment, shared environmental influences actually still show up. They fall out though when you're looking at depression and looking at things like perceived stress and coping. It falls out from the model. Interesting. So the results suggest, as you start looking at these things, as I've looked at them, is that health disparities, for example, is a family affair. It is something that you actually see in patterns of families. And so, what does the doctor ask you when you go in? Do you have does your family have a history of X, Y, and Z? What they're really doing is getting to what the inherited and familial influences may be for different types of diseases. I don't even know if they think about that, but that's what they're actually doing. Genes are associated with disease conditions, but, and I really put the but there, and I should put, but Keith thinks, they're modified and constrained by the environment. That's part of the reason why, and sometimes across generations, you'll actually see breaks in family histories of health. Actually, for your Gen X's, you all are trying to break in some way some of those health problems that you will see in your parents because you're exercising more, you're doing different sorts of things. We'll see if it happens. And if it doesn't, I'm going to laugh, although I probably won't be alive to laugh, but I'm going to say, yeah, I didn't exercise and ha, 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 I got away easy. But there's lots to believe that in aging, that may have an influence where you won't see the same kinds of familial patterns, that we can actually influence and intervene by doing things like physical exercising or caloric restriction, or there's other things as well. Also, that there's intergenerational transfer of health that's evidenced by family effects, the idea that if both people in a family are getting it, it's something that's coming from that parental environment, those genes that the parents are giving, something. That's the intergenerational piece. So I'm sure I'm going long, so I'm going to skip this one. It's just to say that there are, of course, lots of challenges. When you start and get data like this and you start to publish a few things, the best thing to do is to step back for a second and say, so what do I actually know? What really is going on? Well, actually, what do I not know? And I put a whole bunch of things up there, but the thing that I ended with was really understanding patterns of health and mortality within families, trying to disentangle that gene environment is just so interesting. I could end up doing it for a long time. But one of the things that came, and actually it was before I got to Duke, this is results from a study at Duke that was looking what's called the crossover effect. And some people believe in this and some people don't. I believe in it wholeheartedly. And that is the idea that, yes, African Americans tend to have earlier mortality. They have shorter life expectancies on average. Remember, on average means that there are some people that are higher and some people that are lower. So, but then as you look at it, in particular, as you get people that live longer than that average, what you find, even as you compare them to whites, is that somewhere around, they estimate it to be 82 years of age. At 82, you actually see in the population that African Americans have a higher probability of living for the next 5 years. And then when you get to 90, it's even higher. And so there's something going on. You know, it's fascinating. Here's a population that gets taken out early. And then actually, if you make it, you know, if you roll the dice and you do the right thing, whatever it is, you get to later life and actually you're doing better than everybody else. How in the world can that come about to be? So I was inspired by gentlemen like this. I had a video. It was, you need to look at this. He's both fascinating and scary. He's 110 years old. He's one of the oldest or one of the last. I think he said the last, and I was like, I don't know if you're last, but one of the oldest World War II veterans. And they talk about his life and they talk about the things that he's done and how, I mean, he's motoring around. He's doing lots of things. He just gotten his driver's license renewed at this time. And that was the scary part. He was driving, and they show a picture of him. He's driving his truck that I'm a car guy. That's why I fit in Detroit. I'm looking at this truck and I'm like, that truck's a 1978 truck. I mean, he's had it for like almost 50 years now, and he's 40 years, and he's still rolling around in it. But I mean, he's doing like this down the road. You can see it in the video. He is. Austin, Texas. Yeah, not here. Austin, Texas. That's where he lives. Fascinating. If you get a chance, I can even pull that back up if you wanted to take a look at it, because I love the video of him. It is fascinating to hear about what he even accounts for why he's lived as long as he has. And what's even cuter is he's got a girlfriend. And she's only like 90. I mean, he's picking up the young honeys, boy, I tell you. Fascinating. So, I was fascinated by that. I was fascinated by those patterns. I actually took a look back at some of the data. Remember, 800 variables. And I said, well, what can I learn from what I'm supposed to already know? And I said, what about the parents? Because we actually went and looked at birth records. In the state of North Carolina, you can actually go to, they're called record deeds, and you can actually look through and look at birth records. And so what we would do is pick up these books about this Y, and we just page until you saw twin or you saw multiple birth. We said, multiple birth, all right. And then you look and say, white, multiple birth, African American. And then you look, and hopefully it's the next page or the next page. Hopefully they put the record in there, and most of the time we got to them. But we also collected information on where the parents are from, where the actual birth happened. As you go back, and we would go back as far as 1914, most of them were 1917, there was a lot of midwife births. And so sometimes it was a little loosey-goosey about exactly where they were, but they usually would tell you where. Didn't tell you a lot about the birth weight, which we had birth weight on about 25%, unfortunately not everybody. But we did learn about the parents because they talked about the jobs of the parents. And they also talked, if, for example, the father wasn't married to the mother, they said horrible, horrible things in an official record. It's just, it will amaze you if you get a chance to see it. So we looked and saw that, interesting enough, the older the mother at birth, the better the current self-rated health of the subject was. And in siblings and families, the older the participant, the more deceased siblings, the more chronic conditions, the more education, the fewer deceased siblings, the better the current self-rated health. Something about family health that's in there. So I've been given the high sign, and it's so funny and so appropriate that I am both a professor, but I'm the provost. And so basically, I usually get to talk however long I want. So I'm going to try to exercise that, but I won't take too much advantage of it. And I'll move through the rest of this fairly quickly, because I just want to tell you about this last big one. Being a provost, I think I'm not supposed to be doing research. I find it fascinating. I don't want to tell them, a lot of my faculty, I'm doing research, but I'm still doing research. But it came from before I became provost, of having that last big question. I said, I'm a full professor. I'm tired of all of this. I'm going to just criticize everybody else's. I'm not going to worry about doing my own research. But there's still this lagging stuff about what we found in the twin study, and about health and about families. What's going on? What's going on in longevity? What about that stress? Because both in terms of cognition and health, we know it's a big factor. And does stress contribute to patterns of longevity in families? And then I stepped back and said, well, let's ask the even more obvious question: where does stress come from? Those with little babies, guess what happens? Your little baby's wandering around, bumps into a table, falls down. What do? Oh my God. Grandparents go, ha, ha, ha. Get up. And the baby gets up and it's fine. And guess what? Baby laughs. But with that mother or that father who's just freaked out, the baby goes, oh my gosh, I hit my head, it's terrible. I'm still thinking, I'm thinking that we learn stress. We don't necessarily come to this earth with those ideas. We actually learn it. And if we learn it, where does it come from? We can even have a genetic predisposition to being more stressful or less stressful. But I still think that when you figure out whether it's stressful if somebody follows you through a department store, or whether it's stressful if you get, I'll tell you this one additional story, since I'm stretching this way long, I'm supposed to go anyway. I find it fascinating. So I'm the provost of the university. Just about everybody reports to me, and then they also report to our president. He is amazing that he knows more of what's going on than I do. But I work with the police department. I work with our public safety. And I told our police chief, I said, what's weird? I said, I'm a health researcher and we talk about stress all the time, and particularly for black men and how stressful it is when the police come. I said, I can drive on this campus, and when I see your cruisers, I kind of freak out. And he goes, well, don't worry. Everybody knows what your car is. And I'm like, I said, I don't know if I feel better about that. And I said, I still feel like I'm I know I know I'm the provost, but I know I'm a black man, and it kind of freaks me out when I drive by your guys. And he goes, that's exactly how you should feel. You're a black guy in Detroit. You know, it's natural. It made me feel a little better. So, starting trying to put together, I'm always trying to draw out diagrams. I want to try to figure it out, say, how do you think all of this is working together? So I started drawing diagrams, said, real thing I started with was 2 red boxes that said stress and longevity, but what are all the things that could be put together and involved in that? But I wanted to come back to that other question and say, yeah, all of these things are this constellation of effects, but what's happening? Why is it that we're seeing longevity patterns within families and we think that stress will influence longevity? Then I drove this little one and said, it's social learning and it's some genes that actually one generation might have that somehow is passed on to the next generation. The idea that, and I started thinking about it. So did my dad ever teach me to be afraid of the police? I thought, no, he didn't do that. I got that from TV. I got that also from learning real life, and that's how that stress came about to be. But there were other things that I was learning from within that family context. And so I came up with the idea that it's something like this. It's some kind of transmission that's going across generations. We don't just necessarily walk in. So I had a bunch of questions like, do family effects, genes, and shared environment create similarity in the patterns of perceived stress and coping? Does stress account for differences in patterns of longevity between families? Because it's so funny. I tell my retirement people all the time. I tell them, you're trying to set me up to be 90. Nobody in my family has lived 90. So I am going to party like a rock star now and spend all my money because my kids got all my money when I was younger. So, you're saying I need this much money. I don't need that much money to retire. I'm going to spend all of it I'm looking at 82. Now, on the other side, my kids are going to have to take care of me because then who knows how long I'll live. So we come back to this slide about my program of research, and I'm going to share with you this very last study, my last big question, which is SOLSA, the study of longevity and stress in African Americans. And it should have African American families, but SOLSA F didn't sound right. The goal of this project is to study the patterns of perceived stress, active coping, and health status and genes that contribute to longevity observed in African American families. So my colleagues on this are Tyson Brown and Roland Thorpe, 2 other absolutely outstanding African American researchers. We do this out of Durham, North Carolina, but we're going to end up doing 6 different counties. This is still in its infancy. Our goal is to get 750 individuals. Take a look at this piece, and actually it makes more sense when we get to the next one, but 150 short-lived families, 150 long-lived families. The long-lived families are a family where there's a generation above, and then there's 2 siblings below, and the short-lived families are just the 2 siblings here, and there's not a parent who has passed away because of a chronic condition. So, of course, you got to draw a picture. That's what it looks like. You have the siblings, you have that, you kind of can go horizontally and vertically in terms of thinking about the relationships and the possible effects. I try to play like I know how to do quantitative things, and so I thought about it as, wow, think about the comparisons that we can do. We can actually look at these things where we look at just siblings, just saying, let's just look at African American siblings and see what effects are made. We can also look at them as types of families, long-lived families and short-lived families. So we can look at the comparison of siblings and short-lived families to siblings and long-term and long-lived families. And then we can also look at generational effects by looking at that G1 or the first generation and looking at the ones below. Again, here are the measures. Probably supposed to be about an hour and a half. Really logically takes about 3 hours. Here's some of our specific aims is to look at similarities and differences. It's really talking back to those original questions and just figuring out all the different ways that we can actually look at the effects. Because of the background that I have, also my experience with both a couple of my studies, we do collect DNA. And so we're going to be looking at some very specific genes, some related to longevity that have been found in multiple other studies, almost none of which had African Americans in them, and also genes related to stress, which are fairly actually well known by lots of studies that have been done as well. So that's what I'm working on. I always find it interesting that now that I'm a senior person, you sit and say, I didn't really get to all of those things in the way that I think, and maybe the way I speak really fast was me, but I was influenced by a lot of other people, and some of them real directly, some of them indirectly. And I always just like to take a second to thank them. So I think in our program, there's not time right now for questions and answers. I keep getting a high sign that, she's doing like this -5, like I'm 5 minutes over. But what I'll do is stop there and we'll start the panel and I can answer questions for you after all that's done. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Robert Joseph Taylor, and I am the co-chair of the gerontology learning community here at the School of Social Work, and also a faculty member here at the school and at the Program for Research on Black Americans at the Institute for Social Research. And again, I just want to thank Dr. Whitfield for a fantastic presentation. And I'd like to take a minute or two to introduce our panel. And first speaker is Jamie Mitchell. Jamie is an assistant professor here in the School of Social Work, and she's co-director of the Gender and Health Research Lab. Her research focuses on mechanisms of patient-centered communication between older African-American men and their physicians during the course of cancer and chronic disease care. Dr. Barrett Ingersoll Dayton is a professor here in the School of Social Work. She's interested in social support and clinical research with respect to families in later life. Within the area of social support, she focuses on positive and negative aspects of support, gender differences, issues of equity and reciprocity, and cross-cultural differences in marital and intergenerational relationships. And lastly, our last speaker is Mary Rumman, and she's currently a social worker at the Turner Geriatric Clinic. Her work includes psychosocial assessments, care coordination, and education with patients and families. Her practice also consists of individual psychotherapy as well as group therapy in the fields of positive aging and clutter and hoarding. In addition to her work at the Geriatric Center, Mary also leads a caregiver support group and teaches memory classes for older adults. Our plan is for each panelist to speak roughly 10 to 15 minutes. And then after that, we'll have a question and answer for our panelists as well as our main speaker, Dr. Whitfield. So again, let's begin with Dr. Mitchell.
Hi. The real test is whether I know how to work this microphone. It's always a challenge. I'm so grateful to be here and to be on this panel, and thank you, Dr. Whitfield, for your wonderful talk. I will keep my remarks short so that we have lots of time for the panel. I'm really glad that Dr. Whitfield started out talking about the influence of your father on your thinking about family patterning, because I feel like I have very much the same orientation. And so when I started out doing work on African American men's health, I also was inspired by my father and his challenges with health, but also his difficulties in navigating the healthcare system. And he's an educated man, he's a college educated man, he's a car salesman, so he's fairly he does a lot of talking in his regular life, but he freezes up when he goes to the doctor. And so I often find myself stepping in as that family facilitator who helps to kind of move that conversation along or ask those detailed questions. And so that really helped me to think about, if my father, who has this education and is a talker in his regular life, if he freezes up, how much more do African American men perhaps face some barriers to doctor-patient communication? And then what impact is that having if they're not able to have these full conversations with their health providers? What impact is that having on their health? And so I started doing a little bit of work about family, the role of families and their involvement in healthcare communication in particular, but also just in facilitating healthcare navigation and care planning for older African American men over 50 in particular. And so I've done some studies in this area, and I'll keep that brief. But some of the things that I found in particular is that when I asked older African American men in surveys, so more quantitatively, who's responsible, who is influential in helping them communicate with their providers, they overwhelmingly said, myself. I do it myself. I go in there, I ask all the questions, I have no problems, right? But what's interesting is that I've had the chance over the last few years to do some video-based studies. And so I also have a history at Wayne State. I work with my colleagues at Carmano's Cancer Institute, and they have a wonderful archive of videos of doctors talking with patients and their families who've consented to be video recorded over many years. And so I had a chance to go in and look at a sample of African American men, both in cancer care and in primary care, talking with their providers. And what I found in doing that analysis is that African American men from a range of different socioeconomic backgrounds are not necessarily the drivers of their own healthcare communication, as they like to say that they are all the time. And so when I went in and did some kind of fly on the wall observations, what I found is that when family members, but spouses in particular, but also adult children, adult daughters, came into those interactions, particularly in cancer care, they were the ones driving that interaction. They were the ones asking questions, setting agendas, talking and negotiating with the provider about treatment planning, even things like transportation and symptoms and health history. They were filling in all the details. And oftentimes that older African American male patient just sat back and let them do it. And they were really comfortable with that. And so I said, I really need to dig into this because there's some discordance here between how I think some older African American men are framing their agency around and their relationship with their health providers and what actually is happening when you watch them on video. And so I recently did a study with MUFWAR, the Michigan Center for Urban African American Aging. I utilized a great participant resource pool that they have in Detroit. And I went and did some qualitative interviews and really had a chance to dig into this role of family and asking older African American men, what role does family really play in your healthcare interactions? And they came back and were very honest in a way that really aligned with what I saw on video, which is that they were very welcoming of the support of their family members, particularly adult children and spouses, that they felt like they were a team for their health care. And what was interesting is that when I went back to the videos and started looking at what happens in the differences between African American men who have family involvement and those who come alone, there were some really stark differences. And we were actually able to measure down to the number of words spoken, the length of those medical visits, the quality of the communication exchange between providers and those patients. And we saw a stark difference in those men who didn't have that family support. Even if they were higher income, highly educated, they still asked fewer questions. They were less engaged than when they had a spouse or an adult child there with them. And so I really am interested in the ways in which families are involved in reducing health disparities for African American men. And so I got inspired also theoretically by this patient and family-centered care model, which is an upgrade from the patient-centered care model that I think we've been talking a lot about in health and public health and medicine. And so this patient and family-centered care model brings the family into the conversation as much as the patient wants them there. And they really see them as a part of their support network. They bring them in to support them with decision-making, with communication. And I think some of the early studies in this area broadly really show that bringing families into the healthcare interaction changes the dynamic. It increases trust. It brings everybody into the same conversation, and it improves care. And so we haven't done those studies with African American men in particular, older men in particular. And so I'm interested in extending that model a little bit and looking specifically at African American men, particularly because there are so many disparities there. So I was also really taken by Dr. Whitfield's comments on health disparities being a family affair, because I found that in my own work as well. And so when you're looking at issues of cancer treatment, of chronic disease prevention, diabetes, heart disease, things like that, those men, those older African American men who have family involvement, who have the support of spouses, partners, even non-fictive kin, pastors and neighbors who are in their social environment, those people have better outcomes. So right now I'm looking at designing a study that looks at a very specific cancer outcome, and that is how older African American men adhere to oral chemotherapy in their home environment. And so now cancer treatment is changing. And now instead of having to come into a clinic to receive chemotherapy intravenously, they're developing pills that you can take at home. But in order for those pills to be effective, you have to take them at the right time, in the right dosage. And that can be difficult for many patients to do, particularly older adults. And so I'm starting to look now at the role that families play in helping older African American men really adhere to cancer treatment and improve their outcomes around cancer treatment, because I think there's something really significant there. And so I also think that my next steps, my next big questions, I think also not only center around what families can do for older African American men, but what older African American men do and the roles that they play for their families. Because I think we always think of older African American men as the recipients of care, but we don't think of them as the caregivers. And so thinking back to my dad's example, he is a caregiver for my 82-year-old grandmother, and I've worked with him over the years to help him learn how to engage in dementia care, how to navigate talking with healthcare providers and long-term care providers. That's not a skill that came naturally to him, but he was highly motivated to do it because he cared for his mom, right? And he has tons of other friends and acquaintances who are doing the same. And I thought, who out here is studying how African American men are turning the tables and becoming caregivers and not just care recipients? And they are needing to be equipped with communication skills to be the family facilitators for their family members, and not just women and spouses being family facilitators on their behalf. So I think those are some of my next big questions around the role of family involvement in healthcare, but I think it's much more reciprocal than we're seeing in the literature right now. I'm looking forward to engaging in some of those questions. Thank you.
Well, I too would very much like, if you hear this, is this all right? To acknowledge your work, Dr. Whitfield, really inspiring. And there are 3 or 4 themes that you mentioned that I'd like to pick up on. You mentioned intergenerational relationships, the influence of grandparents, skipped generations, and the notion of family ambivalence. And those are all themes that I would like to mention in my remarks today. And then, Dr. Mitchell, I'd like to pick up on your point that older people are not just care recipients, but they're also caregivers. And I think this may be particularly true if you are a grandparent. Lillian Troll, who was a very well-known social gerontologist some 30 or 40 years ago, talked about grandparents as family watchdogs. They were the ones who looked out for the family. They were the ones who stepped in when there was a real need. So this is the theme that I'd like to share with you the next few minutes. And I'd like to focus on this role of family watchdogs in 2 different contexts. One of which is in Thailand, where we often see people migrate and family grandparents need to step in to help out. And the other is here in the United States, where grandparents are often helping out in a variety of ways, such as in the area of mental illness of their children. So those are the 2 contexts that I'll highlight. And here what I want to do is talk a little bit about the impact of that caregiving on the grandparent themselves. In other words, the costs and benefits of that kind of caregiving. So let's go to Thailand first, shall we? As you may notice, I'm wearing an outfit here from Thailand in honor of this country. And I too was inspired by my father, who was an anthropologist in Thailand. So that's part of what brings me to this area of research. Just a little bit of background. Migration, internal migration, meaning migration within the country, is huge in Thailand, as it is in many developing countries where people are unable to find work in their rural, rice-oriented communities. And therefore, as adults, they must migrate to the cities to find work. In Thailand, what's quite common is that people, this would be adult children, young adults and middle-aged adults, will migrate together. This is the husband and the wife will migrate together, but they'll leave their children behind in the care of the grandparents. And what you have then, I wish I had your diagram here, Dr. Whitfield, is those skipped generation households where you have the grandparent, no middle generation, and then just grandchildren. So what's that like for these grandparents, some of whom are in their 60s and 70s, getting frail themselves, in terms of their ability to care for these younger generations? We spoke to a total of 48 grandmothers and grandfathers in different parts of rural Thailand, northern rural Thailand, and did in-depth interviews with them, finding that we really got a lot of deep understanding by doing that. And some of the things that they shared were the burdens that they experienced from this, as you might expect. On the one hand, they were expecting that part of the deal, part of the strategy was that that adult child would be moving, getting a job, making money, and then sending some of that money home. That's part of the family strategy in this kind of migration and grandparents caring for grandchildren. But that didn't always work out that way. People were able to find jobs. If they did have jobs, their expenses were so high they couldn't send them home. And so you had people who were initially very excited about having their kids. This is adult children now. I'm talking adult children who would be 20s and 30s and 40s themselves. Initially saying things like, I thought I wouldn't have to do the arduous work in the fields because my children would send back money and so I wouldn't have to work. That quote is from a woman, herself 64, an older widow, who's caring for her grandchildren. But in fact, when she didn't get those remittances, she had to go back into the rice fields, working, caring for her grandchildren. Still, there wasn't enough money. She had to start borrowing from the neighbors. So that kind of worry, that kind of burden about financial resources was something we heard quite commonly. Another theme in terms of burdens was that feeling of feeling trapped. We sometimes talk about caregiver captivity, don't we, in caregiver burden. And this is also what these grandparents were telling us. I can't go anywhere. It's like I'm imprisoned. And for them, part of the imprisonment was they couldn't go to temple. They couldn't go to the Buddhist temple. And for them, that was huge because one goes to the Buddhist temple in order to make merit for one's present life and one's future life. So the fact that they were feeling entrapped by this caregiving role meant that they were really jeopardizing their own future life well-being. So that was a very impactful negative part of this caregiving that they were giving. On the other side, I want to highlight the pleasures and the benefits of this caregiving. So for example, some of them talked about how much they enjoyed the companionship of their grandchildren. They enjoyed this warm feeling that they got when they were taking care of their children, grandchildren. And some of them talked about enjoying that so much that they didn't want to let their grandchildren go and visit their own children. We had one example of a woman saying, I have 2 grandchildren I'm caring for. I let my daughter take one at a time because I get lonely if they aren't around. So having the companionship of those grandchildren was very central to their sense of well-being. Another thing that it gave them in terms of the benefit side was a sense of meaningfulness and purposefulness. They were engaged in meaningful activity. Said one woman, with the children, we have activities to do. Without them, it would just be me and my husband with nothing to do. So you get the sense here that there are these burdens on the one hand, there are these pleasures and benefits on the other, and often it's the same people who are saying both, which gets us to that notion of ambivalence, that notion of mixed feelings, where very often, as gerontologists, we talk about intergenerational ambivalence as being a key part of family relationships. Okay, ready to come back with me to the United States, where we conducted a study of grandparents who were who weren't caring for necessarily, but who were involved in the lives of their daughters who were mentally ill. who were in turn mothers themselves. So it was a kind of a three-generational family. And I'd like to acknowledge several gerontologists who are amongst us, one of whom is Lydia Lee. Lydia, this is part of a study that you were involved with some years ago, where we were working, Lydia and Letha Chadia and Ruth Dunkel and I and some doctoral students, on a study in which, again, we were interviewing in depth 22, half African American and half white, women from the Midwest, near here, around Michigan and into Ohio, and trying to, again, get a sense of their experiences. And what we learned from that was the challenges, as you might imagine, of trying to care for an adult daughter who needed to have her own sense of autonomy on the one hand, but also needed support. So how do you navigate, how do you negotiate that trying to uphold your adult child's sense of abilities without disempowering them through support? We had people, I love this one example. This was a woman who had become the legal guardian of her grandchildren, but she tried to keep her daughter in the picture. She would get a call from school. The school would say, we know you're the legal guardian. We need you to come in for a parent-teacher conference. And she would immediately call her daughter and say, honey, we need to go to school together. And they would together go to school and have that parent-teacher conference so that the mother could be the mother and not out of the picture. But these were difficult family dynamics that these grandparents were trying to negotiate. Another was the partners of their adult daughters, and how sometimes these would be people who would be abusive and manipulative, and these grandmothers would step in at times. They would literally go over to the homes of their own daughters and kind of kick these men out and say, my daughter does not need you in her life. So it was that kind of protectionism that was going on. But this came at a cost of their worry, a cost of their stress, a cost of their anxiety. On the other hand, I want to talk about the benefits for a moment and say these older grandmothers experienced a strong connection to their daughters who were there for them when they needed it emotionally, and to those very grandchildren who they were caring for. Those grandchildren developed a sense of responsibility for their grandmothers and would come over and help out when there was a need for shopping, for running errands. Even in one case, a granddaughter who was very concerned about her grandmother saying, Grandma, you need to get more food. I'm going to cook for you and I'm going to see that you eat it. I'm going to sit next to you as you eat your food. So that kind of caregiving, not only in the present, I think this is one of the most important points, but in the future. In other words, anticipatory support. These grandmothers felt that for all the caring they had given to their children and their grandchildren, they could expect care in return. So again, I hope you get that feeling that these are difficult roles that these grandmothers are trying to negotiate, and there's a lot of anxiety associated, but some benefits and pleasures as well. So pulling this together, what do we have? We have two very different contexts, right? We have migration, we have mental illness, we have Thailand, we have the United States, the Midwest, our neighbors, but some real commonalities. We have here grandmothers, grandfathers who are stepping in when they're needed. They are the family watchdogs with a mixed impact. Positive, on the one hand, a sense of purposefulness, companionship, a sense of looking forward to the future, that there's a safety net there for them with these family members who they've cared for, but also negatives as well. Worries about family dynamics, worries about having enough resources, worries about the well-being of their grandchildren, their children, and themselves. So in the end, I think we see in both these contexts, grandparents as family watchdogs, and that we as social workers, we as researchers, need very much to be aware of the costs and the benefits that are associated with this kind of caregiving that older adults are giving to their family members, and that as social workers, hopefully we're able to harness some of those contributions, but at the same time acknowledge the stress that they're experiencing and hopefully be able to find ways of supporting these very same grandparents. Thank you.
The green light. Thank you, Dr. Whitfield, for those fascinating comments. I want to hear more and more. Everyone's reinforced how complex families are, and I have the unenviable position of being last after 3 researchers to talk about the clinical perspective. But I would also say that in the last 4 or 5 years, I've also become a caregiver, and some of your story resonates with me, as I also taught my father how to work with a mother who had dementia. And also am the go-to when we go to the doctor's appointment. I'm introduced as the hearing aid every time we go to the doctor's. But I think recognizing as a caregiver myself what caregivers needs also has helped my practice in terms of how I work with families. And some of the things I think as a caregiver that I need is respect, but also to have my expertise be valued. And I think that's really important. Also to be a collaboration with the team, not only with my father and myself, but also with the medical providers to have a collaboration. To be educated about what's going on medically. To have emotional support, and everyone's spoken to that about the validation of what the caregiver's going through, because caregivers don't just show up with no baggage, but there's a lot of complexity. Also, having resource support, having tangible things given to me about what to do. And the other thing as a caregiver, and there's many more, but another thing is having the medical establishment do some of the hard work, be the bad guy. The example that comes up in clinic a lot is the person who maybe shouldn't be driving anymore. And having the medical persons be the bad guy and give that message, not necessarily requiring it to go through the social worker, through the family member to dad or mom or whatever. So I work in an outpatient clinic, and I was trying to reflect on some of the things that we do to address some of the challenges in working with families. The first is that we have to recognize that every single family is different, and start with that premise, asking questions about how the families handle health problems, how the older adults took care of their own family and understanding that, which gives messages about how they want their own children to take care of them. And maybe there's other expectations, other extended family or other group expectations. Another thing, and many of you talked about this, is what actually is the family? Is it the children? Is it the grandchildren? Is it the neighbor, the pastor, the church, whatever. So one of the challenges is figuring out who in the family to talk to, who's the person, the spokesperson. And certainly we always start with the patient and model that the patient is important, and that's the person, that is our client. And that usually helps us glean, who's next. Often the patient will defer to family and maybe not, and that's sort of where we start figuring out who is the decision maker. Another challenge is balancing the patient's voice with the family voice. Sometimes those voices are the same, but many times they're different. And although the patient or our client is our client, it's really the whole family. And we can't, we cannot help an older adult without helping the whole family, without supporting the whole family. But juggling those two different voices remains a constant challenge, not to mention that we often have our own judgments in there that we have to check and figure out. So one of the things that we do in our clinic, and really it's a luxury that I work in this clinic, and because one of the things we do as social workers is we see every new patient that comes into our clinic, and we do an assessment with them. And this is a great model, but the downside is that we can only service our patients and we can't do this for everyone. But one of the things that meeting with people right away does is that we make a relationship before the crisis. We also normalize that older adults, even if they come in the first time and are very independent, may need help in the future. We also can plant seeds in that first appointment. Maybe it's asking about power of attorney, do they have those in place? But also planting other seeds. When we talk about housing, I'll sometimes ask, well, what's your plan for the future? Are you planning to stay in this house? Are you thinking about moving? We don't necessarily get into those discussions, but it does plant a seed. We also can provide really tangible services in a first appointment, which can provide some prevention right away, like a meal program for somebody who might be at risk of weight loss, or an emergency alert system, or helping people get on a prescription drug plan so that they can take their medications to risk hospitalizations. So providing those tangible resources not only can maximize their health care, but also are a way that we build trust in relationships. The other thing that happens at new patient appointments is that we, in addition to see the patient, as you referred to, we see the whole family. We encourage family to be part of that. And I think that really normalizes that family members are part of caring for aging relatives, and that a larger support network is needed. It also helps us gain trust. There's also a form that people fill out, which we call the family and friends form, where the patient can list all the people that we're allowed to talk to. Something that we try to do right away, because that's really valuable in the future when daughter calls, 3 months later and says Dad's having a problem, and we're allowed to talk to them. Otherwise, HIPAA gets really in the way, and we're having these really strange conversations. I can't talk to you, but you can talk to me conversations. Also, I think obviously the psychosocial assessment gives a groundwork for helping in the future. I had a call just the other day of someone who said, well, I talked to a social worker, I don't know when it was, they mentioned a resource, can you help? And I was able to look up the appointment, which was 3 years earlier, but she remembered the resource and were able to tell that. And I also knew I could quickly read what the family patient situation might be. The other thing that we do in our clinic is have family meetings, and I think those are some of the most important things that we do, usually to problem solve next steps about caregiving and also to educate. And one of the things it does is it helps us sort out those family dynamics that are going on. You talked about the different ways that people respond to stress, understanding, different people definitely respond to stress differently, determine who those decision makers are, and give us a chance to figure out who wants to be involved and who doesn't, and to validate all that people do as caregivers. Obviously, these are, the more I listened to you, the more I got stressed out thinking about how complicated I thought our families were, and now they're even more complicated. But there's so many complicated situations that come into the office, and we have, we just touched the iceberg about what those are, but they can include, potential abuse, exploitation. They can have mental health issues, both in the parent or the child or other people in the family. There's also family dependence on older adults. So all of these things are in the mix. And one of the things we can't really do is solve the family. We can't fix the family. But obviously we're attuned to things like exploitation and abuse, but really sometimes we just have to acknowledge the elephant in the room, that yes, these two siblings have been fighting for years. They're never going to necessarily get along. But what we can do is look for commonalities, common goals. And I think Another challenge in those meetings is really who, helping the family members figure out how they're going to be involved. Because sometimes there's a lot of reluctance for good reasons. One is that families members want to keep some families want to keep their older adult autonomous and, making decisions for themselves. Sometimes stepping in is difficult to adjust to those role changes. Sometimes there's financial, other geographical, other reasons why people don't want to step in. So having a family meetings allows us to have teamwork. We can find the common ground, those common goals for people. For example, a really typical situation is an older adult with dementia who lives in their home, and more they're becoming potentially unsafe. And maybe we can decide, as everyone can agree on safety. They might come at how you get to safety in many different ways, but we can agree on that. And we can, the family meetings also allow us to really think about who's involved, identifying other people than just the family that can play a part. And also we often leave those meetings with some assignments about who's going to do what and how we go forward, and can include that out-of-town family member who may not be in the room, might be on the telephone, and what they can do, because there's a lot of things that out-of-town family members can do to support an older adult. Another thing that we do in our clinic, and as part of these family meetings and others, are education. And I got to say that everybody wants to be educated differently. Some people want to hear everything they can about a certain diagnosis. Some people are scared off. So, the first question is, what did you hear the doctor say? And that's all over the place. But it allows us to clarify and give education about what's going to happen. But what do you want to know, and how do you want to get that information are also questions that we ask. We also talk about risk tolerance, which is another whole topic, but how sort of challenging families to think about how much risk the patient's willing to take for their own safety. That person, again, living at home, I want to live at home no matter what. How much the families can take. Just talked to a family the other day, mom's living at home as caregivers all day, but she's alone at night. And for a while that risk was okay, but then the family members found that risk became harder. So understanding that risk, just like stress and all those other things, people's tolerance for that varies. I can talk about a lot of more things, but we also do just general support. And I think you made a good point about caregivers. One of the groups I lead is caring for your mate. And not only are people caring for their spouse, but they're also having their own health problems. So I think any ways that we can be supportive emotionally to caregivers is important. But our ultimate goal here is that we want to support families in taking care of the older adult, and a recognition that we really can't change the family system, but we can still work within it to establish goals and focus on change. And that early intervention, anytime we can get early intervention, it can be really important because it helps us be prepared for the potential crisis. We do also see families who are in crisis from day one, but it does lay some groundwork. And that one size does not fit all. There are no right answers, and really we need to approach every family and understand their own system as we collaborate with them caring for their older adults.
So what I'd like to do now is to open this session up for a question and answer. We will have somebody come around with a microphone. The microphone is critical that you speak into it because we are videotaping this. And for people who are not here, this will be on the University of Michigan School of Social Work's YouTube channel. And in particular, there's a channel, a sub-channel for the gerontology learning community. So this should be up there probably next week for friends that you may have who can't make it. So again, we'll have Keith come up, Dr. Whitfield come up, and please raise your hand for questions. And again, the questions will go to our panelists or to Dr. Whitfield.
This is a policy question of how we plan to address the tsunami of aging that is coming, and I know with this panel we're going to figure it out. And we're very interested in seeing from your perspective what needs to be done to address the aging that's the onslaught that's coming. And I speak because of a self-interest. So I want to make sure I'm taking care of it.
So let me start because we've got, I think, fascinating different perspectives here. You're right. You don't know whether to call it a tidal wave or tsunami or what it is, but we know, even just demographically, that we're going to be changing. Actually, the real critical year is 2030. That's going to be the front end piece of what has been ticking up, but a true significant difference in the number of older people. I actually even have a question for you all because I thought it was fascinating. I use the term aging sometimes, and I try sometimes to avoid older because what does older actually mean? And it means differences relative to health. And that's what's so fascinating is that it's not just by age, it's almost by how young you think you are. And so hopefully what's going to happen is that tsunami in terms of the number of demographics that we have are actually being intervened, both in terms of some of the social issues, the health issues, the navigating actual health care so you can improve. One of the things that you see as you look at even looking at life expectation is that it's going up. It's actually going up a little faster for whites than it is for blacks, but it's still going up. And so what you'd like to be able to have is at 2030 a time when people are living as healthy lives as possible, as long as possible. Now, what does that mean? Actually, our panelists did some very interesting, they were hitting on a lot of interesting things. Some of it is health care. Some of it is dealing with daily needs care. Some of it is dealing with mental health care. All of those things don't actually always happen right at the same time. So there's still then different things that may happen, even if we have this healthier generation in 2030, where there still may be pluses and minuses and benefits and costs. And I think what you heard here, which is so interesting, when you all, varying lengths of time have been in aging research, I won't assume who's been what, but we've talked about some of these things for a long time. Actually, what you heard a lot about was caregiving. And caregiving is one of those things that it actually goes in waves. People think it's the most important thing. They actually see that, for life and death, caregiving is important. And then it turned into, so what does it mean for the caregiver? That there's stress, that there's frustration, there's trying to figure out responsibility. I found it fascinating, the cultural differences that actually exist. We have some of that variability even within the United States. I was listening to your stories and thinking, that's so interesting. From a psychologist's point of view, I would want to know the personality because you told these two different stories where one was, a lot about the burden and the other was a lot about the joy. And you find that variability when you look in the US, but you wonder where it comes from. And maybe that needs to be the next wave of caregiver actual interventions. I know even for some, it's looking at the caregiver. So again, as you're talking about the tsunami that's coming, if we have people taking care of them, what is the impact of taking care of? And so looking at the health of those caregivers, looking at some of the roles that go back and forth between those caregivers actually being healthy or whatever themselves. So you always bring extra slides. So we had done some work, Martha Crowther and I had done some work looking about, I think Jamie may have been talking about some of the things relative to who takes care of something. And we had another person as well talking about the mental health issue piece of it. And it's the idea of, as you grow older, actually even as an older person, are you in a position both financially and mentally and health-wise to take care of them? So I just listening from fast, and I'm like, yeah, there's these back and forths that go back and forth as we think about the effects downstream, about the effects upstream, about the children taking care of the parents, and the parents taking care of children or grandchildren, however it may play out. And some of those critical features are, as you have aged, how well have you aged? And what we found in looking at grandparents is that custodial grandparents, again, what you're seeing is a significant increase in custodial grandparenthood. Some of it is because of the opioid addiction. Some of it's because of other drug things that they're being given to children. The grandparents are taking care of children. And I was listening to both of the stories and thinking, it's so interesting because what we have found is that those who are custodial grandparents end up doing better on everyday problem solving. But we were trying to figure out, so basically, wow, their brains are, and you make the quick assumption, wow, so taking care of kids makes your brain better. And anybody who's taking care of kids does not think that's true. But then step back and say, well, so what is it? Is it that custodial care actually provides the kinds of stimulation, attention, and things that actually keeps your brain healthy? Or is it that you were selected to be the custodial grandparent because you are already there? And we haven't followed up on that, but it's a question to ask when you're thinking about how the shape of our population is changing. It's no longer the upside pyramid or whatever it's supposed to be. It's actually going to be that we're going to see it more like this. It's going to be a lot more people in those older generations. And what is that going to mean? What is that going to mean in terms of care? Even listening to somebody who actually understands old people from a clinical perspective is just heartening, because what you find is that you don't find as many board-certified geriatricians and clinical folks, but they're dealing with them. And I always wonder whether, is that a good thing or bad thing? They have the experience, but, my car's being worked on. I'm actually not going to be able to pick that up. I'm very frustrated. But I want a board-certified person working on my car. I don't want Jim the mechanic that, on Saturday he works. You kind of want that expertise and that experience. And what we're finding is that the numbers are far outpacing the experienced people in the field. And so how then can they deal with the increased number of people with those issues, trying to figure out all of those different things? If you want a job, because guess what? You're aging, I'm aging, we all do it. Doesn't matter what race, color, or creed. You gotta age. We're not going to be Benjamin Buttons. He was going the other way. I don't know. But there are challenges. I'll stop and let my colleagues comment on that as well.
I think you got it.
The question was, the question was the tsunami. It's coming at us. Other questions?
My name is Vivian Lee. I'm a faculty at School of Social Work. First, I want to thank you, Dr. Whitfield, and this wonderful, entertaining presentations. I just want to respond to this gentleman's question about the issue about the growth of elderly population. And I don't know whether I can request just maybe just not using the word of tsunami of this word. The reason is that tsunami is a disaster.
Yeah, that's good.
Bringing crisis to us. But I think that we are undergoing a population transition, disruption change. We are lucky that we can live longer. Okay? That's why there's a growth of elderly population. And that's an achievement of our society. And as just the panelists here talk about, older people have brought a lot of contributions to the family and to the society as well. Like your grandparent style, just having fun with the grandkid, that's fine. Or the other grandparent style, really raising grandchildren, taking on the parents' role. That's a big contribution. Allow the younger generation to really go out to the city to work or to do other things. So I want to, that's a bigger issue that we can address here. But this thing called the software language. We are lucky. We can live to see this long life ourselves and our parents and grandparents.
Well, she's doing the positive aging stuff, huh? Yeah, I agree with you wholeheartedly. I hate the, it actually started with the movie. Where the little lady comes up and says, "Where's the pizza?" And it's such a negative portrayal of grandma going to Wendy's. And I don't like those things. I can identify though with your perspective of the idea of a tsunami, because my concern is that we're still not prepared to handle the changes that are going to make. And some of them actually we don't need to handle. What's going to be cool is, as you said, there are going to be cultural changes that actually happen. Maybe we don't have as many. Actually, the commercials have changed. So have you seen the commercial where it's for a cell phone company? And the older folks are out at a skateboard park, and they're saying, like, yeah, and it's this 90-year-old woman saying, like, yeah, and it was like, and it's the idea that, let's challenge some of those ideas about what older people are supposed to do and not do. Read all the psychology into it, they were selling phones. But is the idea that the tsunami piece of it is that there's a challenge in us being able to have doctors that are prepared, nurses that are prepared, social workers that are prepared, psychologists that are prepared to be able to deal with. I think it's like the preponderance of issues. Like now we're dealing with opioids. I mean, so if you want to be a social worker and definitely get yourself a job, you deal with people around substance use. It's going to be there for a while. We're seeing the front end of it, not the back end. And I think that's the challenge for folks who've been in gerontology for a long time. We were always told, oh, just wait, boy, gerontology is going to be the thing. And now it is, and it still needs to be the positive piece of it. It is all of the contributions. You actually have to weigh it out and not think about it as all bad. It's the challenge is, are we actually ready for it as a country? And I still watch TV and think sometimes I'm afraid that we're not. I'm afraid that we actually haven't actually accepted what the benefit of older people can actually contribute to society. It is interesting though, our president's the oldest president ever to be elected. That's what it was. Example nonetheless. Any more questions?
Really said a lot of what I wanted to say, and I'd just like to offer that we put it in a bigger perspective, that there, and part of this, the nice thing about this panel is kind of bring together researchers and policy makers and clinicians around the line. That's what we need to do, is kind of revolutionize our whole perspective. The good thing is, we are living longer, so think about it as 30 years of being old, 60 to 90 or so. People living longer. There's going to be, and there's research on things like mindfulness and the importance of making a contribution and the importance of bidirectionality and support and caregiving. And there's a whole multidisciplinarity to it now. There will be great technological, already have been, but will continue to be great technological advances, or engineers are going to help us with the kind of major problems people have been having, say on mobility, transportation, from that care, but also in terms of monitoring your own health so that you can tell whether you can do this or that or the other thing today or not. But I think what we need to do is help be part of that revolution, which changes the way we think about aging. Because also the changing demographics of multi-generations will mean that we need those generations. We need that third and fourth generation to help with the first and second generation, not only the third and the fourth. So all of those things, we need that revolution of how we look at it. So it's not a tsunami. It's not to deny that there are people. It's not a tsunami of bad stuff, as Lydia said, but there is going to be more available people to help us address the problems of our society.
Good job. Nice job.
Thank you so much for this talk. I thought it was wonderful of the panelists. My question is, two questions in one. What do you all think about engaging the younger generation who are growing up maybe with this culture of be as young as you can, and maybe this younger generation we're like, I just put them in a nursing home. And then secondly, how do you consider like engaging technology in this?
I can maybe just speak to one of the two. I don't know about the younger generation. Putting older generations in the nursing home. I was, just from personal experience, I was really fortunate to grow up with my grandmother, who's now my grandmother that I'm helping my dad to take care of. And I think even now, when you said that Dr. Whitfield talked about how we think we grow up and then we later reflect on how we really are more like our parents and grandparents, and I see a lot of myself in my grandmother. And her resourcefulness and the fun that we had, kind of what grandparents can do, right? Spoil you and then leave. And so I'm really appreciative thinking back on that. So I hope that younger generations are growing up and will also kind of gain that wisdom with time and be more reflective about the value of the older adults in their lives. But I can speak a little bit about the technology piece because I'm actually doing some work around e-health and looking at how do we leverage older adults, especially older cancer survivors' usage of technology and mobile technology, because more and more older adults have cell phones, and not only do they have cell phones, but they're using them not only for communication and for fun and games, but also to take care of their health. Right? They're using WebMD apps. They're using apps to reorder their prescriptions with Walgreens. Some of them are using e-health apps to communicate with their providers. And so I'm working with a team at Carmanos that is surveying something close to 800 older cancer survivors and looking at how they use different categories of e-health activity. And they're trying to actually design an app just for them to help them kind of marshal these cancer survivorship resources in a way that is aging friendly, but also is tailored to their specific needs. And so I really see that as kind of the next frontier. And we've been really fortunate to have some MSW students who have gone on to work for Ford Motor Company and for other transportation and tech firms and larger corporations, looking at the role of technology and transportation and some of these, leveraging some of these new innovations for older adults particularly. So I really think there is so much to be done in that area around how do we work with older adults to leverage technology, to help them to utilize technology both for entertainment and to reduce things like loneliness, but also to enhance their health, especially if they're homebound or if they don't have that family support.
I'd like to answer the first part of that question, Chonge, okay? And that's to say that at least one kind of innovative approach has been, if you haven't had the kind of contact that you have described, Jamie, of living with your grandmother, what about just getting to know an older person? And one of the areas that I'm really fascinated by is reminiscence therapy. I imagine a lot of you who work with older adults know that reminiscing is a part of what is so common for older adults. But what about if you put a younger person in charge of that? And by that I mean having the younger person be the interviewer of the older person. And so a few of the studies that have been tried with this kind of model, where the younger person is the interviewer listening to and asking the questions of the older adult, show that older adults very much enjoy the interaction and are likely to reminisce more. But also the younger people are talking about the positive impact on themselves and their own sense of enjoying listening to aging and maybe even being interested in talking to another older person about their experiences. So I think we need to find these small windows by which older adults and younger people can have more interactions. And that's at least one example.
I don't have a ton to add, but I have a colleague whose daughter is thinking about creating some sort of intergenerational home to live in, where there's people in all generations. I mean, it's not like it's never been thought of before, but I think that the wave of the future is maybe different models than what we have now. There's so much regulation that people in facilities, you can do this, but you can't do this. And that kind of a model where you're living with a bunch of people, where people can help each other without necessarily having to meet X regulation fits. The other thing, technology, and I don't know a ton about technology, I wish I did, but I do know another thing that people are using are cameras in homes. And I'm just talking to a patient the other day whose mom lives with him. She has some dementia, but he works pretty close by, but he's got this camera I think there's ethical implications about the cameras, but in his case, mom thought it was a great idea and is pretty, and that's allowing him to keep her there and keep tabs on her. So that's just one of many examples of technology that's being used.
Well, my second question or thought that I had when Tony just said what she said was that this whole idea that we're going to live longer is going to create maybe 4 generations. And in relation to what you just said, it kind of takes us back. Maybe people will be more oriented towards intergenerational living together and caring for their family members over generations as it was before, and as you said. So that seemed kind of hopeful to me. Right, in both directions. And I've seen on Facebook a video, I think it was from another country, and maybe that's the problem with our regulations here in this country, of a younger person moving in with as a roommate to an older person. I'm not sure if it was in an institutional setting, but how helpful that was to both of them. But what I was going to say first is that I was here, I think, last year, and I'm not sure which year it was, but the whole topic was about being trained, the whole training for home care for older adults, and the panel. I'm sorry, I'm eating something that's a mint just flew out of my mouth. Moments, right? Of how people got interested in gerontology and how people wanted to go to caregiving, and a lot of the panel members who are now studying, like you were, talked about their experience with their own family members and how close they were to their grandparents and how that made them interested. And I think the whole focus was supposed to be that the School of Social Work should start creating focuses in this or degrees in this and programs so that we would have people coming out trained in this area, if I understood what we were supposed to learn the last time.
And as you get to the next person, I would just want to throw something in. It is interesting, going back to the question about technology. So we were talking about technology that actually is kind of age-centered, age-appropriate, thinking about, the problem-solving sorts of things that older people have to do. Well, what's so fascinating is that if you think about it in a larger societal piece, and I'm thinking about it being here at Michigan, and unfortunately I'm not going to have a chance to see you all's place, but I know that you all are doing it, and we're thinking about doing it, and that's getting more into mobility. And actually, see, I came back and talked about my car again. My car is a Tesla, and it will drive itself. Oh. And when you think about, like I said, just talking about the older gentleman who was weaving down the road, the idea that we will be able to allow there to be greater mobility for people that may be impaired as time goes on, or even be able to it's going to be real soon. You can get in a car and say, take me to the doctor. The idea of that, when we think about some of the possible interesting interventions that can happen and how it's going to change society, even as we talk about the multiple generations, take me to my granddaughters, take me to my great-granddaughters.
Not even need a car. You'll just use a self-driving vehicle that's multiple. I just saw one last week.
Yeah, there's one. You guys have a track out here. We're a little interested in, but that issue of autonomy and driving, it's one of the things when you think about aging that people are very stereotypical about older people driving and things. Well, some of that's not be erased.
But young people aren't driving. That's really fast. Yeah.
Well, and what it does is it actually levels the age. It's an age leveler. Then all of a sudden, actually, anybody here from Florida? You guys are terrible drivers. Oh my gosh. Think about the kind of leveling that it'll do. It's both age leveling, it's distraction leveling, it's all of these different things in which such a central piece of our lives will actually be changed. And in some small way, how will that change how we think about aging? It'll take it out of it.
So we have time for one more question and a short answer.
It's a quick one. Hi, I'm Marwa. I'm a student here at the School of Social Work, and one of my career goals is actually bringing this more culturally effective care to minority populations, specifically Arab American populations. And so I had a question for you, Mary, over at the clinic. Do you guys have you experienced any cultural barriers, and then how do you guys navigate around something like that?
That was a brief question. There's always cultural barriers, and we also have a luxury of having interpreters, which is really helpful, and that does make a difference, because when you're interpreting with a family member, you don't really know what's being said. In fact, I just talked to someone the other day, and she's been interpreting for mom, and mom thinks that the daughter is telling us that she has dementia, not the other way around, as an example.
Just how do you navigate around it? What is it that you guys are doing as the agency?
It's a good question. We are trying to figure out, again, the same kind of things. So who's the decision maker? What is your culture, whatever it is, say about healthcare? Those kinds of questions. I don't know if that's a short answer.
Okay, I would like to thank one last time our panelists and Dr. Whitfield. And again, this is the conclusion of our program, but as you see, there's lots of reserves and coffee and things to drink, so please hang around for a minute. Dr. Whitfield will be here, and our panelists will be here if you have any questions. Yes.